Welcome to What's Best Forum's Masters and Makers interview series. I'm Ron Resnick. If you like this video, please kindly click like and subscribe to my What's Best Forum YouTube channel. Today we are meeting Art Noxon, founder and designer at Acoustic Sciences Corporation. Art, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ron.
Before we get to acoustic room treatments, I'd like to understand your basic starting setup process. For example, Jim Smith focuses first on the listening chair and positions the listening chair in the area of smoothest bass. What is your first step when setting up a room?
I look at the room. About half of the rooms that we get a chance to work on are actually being run sideways or backwards because people set rooms up according to their visual preferences. The sound isn't about that way. The sound is a sound stage, and then there's an audience area, and then there's the back wall. What happens to the back wall at the back wall? So the first thing to do is to orient the room so that it is playing as sensibly as it can, considering the room's geometry and what's around in the room and outside of the room. So you basically have to reorient the listening footprint, and then we can actually work on the room. And a lot of times, you just by reorienting the room, you've solved a substantial amount of listening problems and frustration for the listener.
By reorienting the room, you mean starting with an open mind as to where the positioning of the loudspeakers and the listening chair should be.
Yeah.
Somebody might start thinking it should be against the short wall, and you might say, no, it should be in the corner or something, depending on what the nature of the room is.
Right, right.
And so is there a particular place you start? Do you start by focusing on the listening chair or the loudspeakers, or it's a combination?
It's always the loudspeakers and how the loudspeakers fit into the room. Major problem in listening room work is that the energy created by the loudspeaker ends up stored essentially in the front end of the room, the front third of the room. And then that stored reverberation, I call it early reverberation, but it's between parallel walls, and it's a huge amount of vibrations, and it's stored back and forth, vertical, diagonally. And then that stored energy, nobody's even heard the sound yet, is starting to store reverberation in bass in the front of the room. And then that oozes out because it's an expansion of stored energy. So you have the direct signal followed immediately by reverberant buildup in the front of the room that expands out and covers up the information in the direct signal, because what's stored sounds just like the direct signal, except it's chaos. And so it's a signal to noise issue on a very fast time scale. And so that's the first job to do, is to make the room listenable so that it's intelligible.
And so what's the first thing somebody should do in that vein to address treble frequencies?
After we've cleared up the ability of the expansion of the bass wave and minimized its ability to overwhelm the listener, treble is mostly about imaging, of course, musicality, but also imaging, because audio is listening to music, but also the imaging of it, and the imaging all belongs to the treble. So once we clean up the treble, the imaging starts to appear, and the defects in imaging. So of course you have the sidewall reflections and the floor sidewall reflections and the ceiling sidewall reflections. So you have three zones of early sidewall reflections that are responsible for primarily distorting the image and the soundstage. People usually don't even think about the ceiling wall reflection and the floor wall reflection. They just think about the ear level wall reflection as the one they put up a little sound panel there and call it good. And they forget about that there's two more paths that come into the ear at just a barely few milliseconds later that are just about as strong. So there's actually three sidewall reflections.
And so you focus on addressing the bass frequencies first, and then deal with the treble later?
Yep.
And what's the first thing somebody should do to address bass frequencies?
Add bass traps to the front, on the sidewalls and in the front corners. Add bass traps to the sidewalls and front corners so that their buildup of lateral and vertical, diagonal reverberation is minimized. If you don't aggressively deal with that, you just have a huge signal to noise ratio, because the front end is bleeding reverberant chaos in the bass range. It sounds just like the music, except it's out of time, and it bleeds over the listener and fills in all the quiet spots, and it's a signal to noise. It's like a communication channel. It's got way too much reverberation in it to understand what's being said. So you add bass traps to the front third of the room. But the ceiling is equally involved, and it's a little trickier to add bass traps to the ceiling. It's not a popular concept. It bothers the vision of a beautiful stereo setup. I like to add boxes that are bass traps or on the floor, sort of in the behind the speakers, but out in the middle of the room. I mean, you have to deal with the vertical. You can't just ignore, the buildup of reverberation in front of your face. The easy ones are the sidewall bass traps along the sidewall, but don't forget the vertical.
On the reverberation point, what's the simplest way for an audiophile to learn how his or her room is performing? Could something even as simple as that Clap Reverb app on iPhones, which crudely measures reverberation time, is something like that potentially helpful in the very beginning?
It's educational. We're not looking for the room reverberation time. That's way, way down the time scale of listening. We're way up in the front end. We're talking about 15 milliseconds. So what you really are looking for is how quickly does the first 5 dB of reverberation drop out? How quickly does the first 10 dB of reverberation? Because that's what's up in the front of the room, the first 10 dB. The tail of the reverberation, which no one is, so far away and so quiet that it doesn't interfere with anything. It's ambience practically. I developed was a thing called the MAT test. It's a rapidly gated slow sine sweep, and sounds like bop 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 bop, and then I go back down bop 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 bop. And the burst rate on that is a 16th of a second tone burst, followed by a 16th of a second silence. And if you can hear 10 dB difference between the actual tone burst and the reverberation that's unloading on top of you immediately following that tone burst, you've got a reasonable room, 10 dB. 5 dB difference between the tone burst and the reverberation room immediately following the tone burst in the 16th of a second scale. Your room is barely performing. And it's sounding like blah, 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 blah. It's awful. 15 dB is professional recording studio level performance. 20 dB difference is the maximum threshold of human perception at that burst rate. 20 is the maximum that you can concern yourself, and you don't need. 15 is great. 10 dB is reasonable. 5 dB is pretty awful. And anything less than 5 dB is scrambled eggs. I mean, you can't hear anything.
And MAT is a service. You sell the CD.
No, we give it away.
The client does the measurement and then sends you the results for your analysis.
Well, the first thing is for them to listen and think about, while you're listening, think about what you're hearing. I had a client, we played the MAT test, and he says, "Oh, I know what this is." He goes to the shelf, pulls out a record, lays it on the turntable, goes over, selects the track, plays it. He said, "Now just wait and listen." And all of a sudden, there's a musical moment, and it's all garbled. He says, "That's what has been bothering me all this time." The audiophile already knows this stuff. This is nothing new. This is just an organized, structured way of getting it all out there within a minute of test time. So the first thing is just listen to it. You can record it and send it in and have it analyzed by us and then get the printout. But the main thing is listen to it, because when you listen to it, you go, "Oh, that's what it is." You can also listen to it from an image perspective and watch the image bloom and focus and run around the room.
To deal with first reflections on the sidewalls, is there a principled way to figure out whether first reflections on the sidewalls should be absorbed or diffused, or does the audiophile simply have to experiment?
There are two first reflections, and it's really important to track this. The earliest reflection is the one commonly recognized. It goes from the right speaker to the right wall and into the right ear. And we know what that does. That causes the apparent speaker position to move to the right a little bit based on how loud and the time delay of that reflection. But there's another reflection that's oh so much more important, to the point of forget the near wall reflection. If you've got a near wall reflection, scooch the speaker over a little bit to the left, a little bit, and forget about it. When the reflection hits, it'll move the speaker to where it's supposed to be. according to your setup, and you'll be fine. The problem is the opposite speaker. The left speaker comes across in front of the listener, hits the right wall, comes into the right ear. Now you've got left information in the right ear. It kills imaging, because imaging is all about treble, left, right, head shadowing, level difference, interaural, time delays. And when the left speaker is playing into the right ear at down about 3 dB, you have zero imaging. So it's the left speaker bouncing into the right ear. And that reflection point is not the same as when the right speaker bounces into the right ear, closer to the plane of the speakers, because it's a steeper angle.
To handle those two reflections on each sidewall, should they be absorbed or diffused, or again, is it a matter of experimentation and personal preference?
If you absorb them, they disappear from the acoustic space. The ambience is reduced because you've taken out a huge chunk of sound very early in its life. It was very loud, and now you've eliminated a large amount of acoustic power that was going to fill the room up with ambience. If you use a diffuser, you can't hear it anyway. And I'm talking about a smooth surface poly diffuser. I'm not talking about the tricky multi-level energy storage and reverberant discharge type diffusers, RPG class. When you listen to a poly diffuser, put it up on a wall, talk at a wall, slide the poly in, talk at it, you think that you're talking into a sound absorber, except you're not. All that energy is, the reflection is down enough that you don't really hear it. It sounds like it's been absorbed, but yet you know that energy is still in the room. You haven't taken it out of the room. If your room is too bright, use absorption. If you got a lot of records stored in the room and a carpet on the floor, it's not too bright. It's starting to die down, and you don't want to further kill the ambience in the room, so you use a diffuser. But a soft poly diffuser is the style that really works great and doesn't add any sonic aberration.
If somebody is handling the sidewall first reflections by putting two 9-inch tube traps on each sidewall, is it a matter of experimentation whether to have the tube trap absorption side out or silver button diffusion side out?
If we're going to do it with two, you want one to deal with the early reflection that narrows this, gets a stage so that it's lined up with the speakers. And then you want the other one to deal with the crosstalk reflection. Remember, the crosstalk reflection is the first one to do. Don't even waste time on stage widening. That's a minuscule issue. It's the crosstalk that kills imaging. So you use ray tracing. You put a flashlight on the speaker and shine it on the wall, on the left wall. So put it on the left speaker, shine it on the left wall, and then it's going to come across and hit a spot on the right wall. Put a second mirror there, and then eventually you're going to get hit in the face. So you kind of fiddle with it around, or have a friend fiddle with it until it actually is working. And then that gives you the signal path. You can also do that by putting the flashlight on the floor and letting it skim across the carpet. And that way you can watch the beam zigzag right there, and you can leave it there, and then you can know exactly where to put what, because you can see the rays tracing on the surface of the fuzz on the carpet. Really a fun thing to do.
To the question of whether the two tube traps on each side should be rotated absorption side out or diffusion side out, how does the audiophile tell which is the right way to go? What should he or she be listening for?
Now, this is when you've got two of them close to the wall.
Right.
And in that case, you really don't want to have either of them with the reflectors forward into the room. What you do is you start thinking way in advance. If the front of the room is a little quiet and not quite ambient enough, take the right speaker and the right reflection and take that and rotate the reflector so that it backscatters into the front of the room. And that way you fill the front of, you start to fill. Remember, it's very loud at that point. You've got the wall and you've got the reflector itself. So you've got a double-sized reflector going on there. And so it's like a corner, and you're throwing that sound back into the front of the room and filling that front of the room up, because sometimes the front of the room just is lacking ambience, lacking diffusion, lacking ambience. And the great place to catch that is a first one. And then the second one, rotate that backwards so it's looking at the rear wall, because later on, the sound's going to come down past your shoulder, close to the wall, hit the rear wall, come back up, it'd be expanding, and it's going to hit the back side of that reflector that's dealing with the crosstalk. It'll hit that back side of that reflector, and then you'll have a very strong time delay, very low level splash. off of that. And that begins to increase the stage width and starts to address the issues of spaciousness.
So you like the idea of having the flexibility to use the reflectors to redirect some of that energy rather than just a flat absorption panel for the sideways.
Absolutely. It's a thrill.
In a domestic living room environment, there's a lot of native furnishings,
Yeah,
chairs,
right.
couch, table, artwork, bookshelves. Those natural furnishings have absorptive and diffusive properties. Do those natural furnishings obviate the need for commercial acoustic products in living rooms?
To some degree, yes, but also they can be distracting. As you do formal acoustics in the room, the image starts to tighten up. The speed and the tempo of things start to track. And so now you're hearing the music better. What happens is that you've got a nice lampshade over here. And all of a sudden, you realize that at a certain frequency range that fits the size of the lampshade and the beam pattern of the speaker, at a certain bandwidth, the image seems to start to slash off to the right. Well, it's moving towards an early reflection off a lampshade that is catching that and bouncing it back. So now we've got a strange diffuser in the room that all of a sudden we become sensitive to. When the room's kind of not well treated, you might have some bass traps in the corner and some simple things here and there. It doesn't matter because there's so much chaos in the room anyway that a little more or less, it doesn't matter because we're not really controlling the room. We're just trying to calm it down and let it go. We're not trying to make a listening studio. We're just in a residential setting. When the room's getting tighter, all of a sudden you hear things ringing. You say, what's that? No, you go touch a lampshade and you tap it. So, wow, that lampshade, it sounds like a cymbal now. The sound is twanging it. Decorations in the room, things start rattling. The more you tighten the room up acoustically, the more you hear all these domestic gadgets starting to ring. It's distracting and a little irritating. And so you basically go through and when you hear one and you notice it, and then you go over and figure out what to do about it. Add a little sticky something to quiet the twang down. Just a piece of masking tape will be enough damping. I mean, we're talking about some very slight things, but in a tight room, you hear them.
What is your opinion on the rule of thirds? Is that a reasonable place for an audiophile to start in terms of positioning the loudspeakers and the chair initially?
Yeah, rule of thirds. When you calculate it out, it's not exactly a third. I think it was 29%. What that is about is that you're trying to not create longitudinal standing waves that are fed by the speaker. What you don't want is have a round trip distance between the speaker and the rear wall and the speaker in the front wall to be at the same time in terms of wavelengths, the same number of wavelengths, so that you end up with a reinforcement of the front wall and the rear wall reflections at the speaker, because that causes the speaker to play loudly or to play quiet. That's not about your hearing. That's about the speaker powering the room, dumping energy into the room. So if you have a phase add at a certain frequency, the speaker is playing into high pressurized air, so to speak. It's more efficient and it plays louder because it's dumping more energy into the room at that situation. If it's playing into a phase cancel, round trip distance is a half a wavelength or 1.5 wavelengths, then it's inefficient. The low pressure in front of the speaker is lower. It's all kinetic energy. And the speaker pushes forward and there's no air pressure to push back, so it can't create pressure. So you've got one problem going on with the speaker because it's in a hard boundaries. If you put bass traps in, that kind of stuff goes away. Now we have the listener, and the listener's got kind of like the same problem, which is the rear wall bounce and phase add or cancel. Usually when you set a room up so that it plays properly, rooms have doors, and a lot of times rooms are even kind of open in a certain area. That openness or those doors, that softness in the wall, that should be behind the listener. The front of the room is tight and you can control that. The back of the room should be open and vented as much as possible and like leaky. So when you're setting a room up right, you really don't have a strong rear wall phase add cancel. You do have with the speakers, but you deal with that with acoustics. But the rear wall is dealt with by venting is a fantastic tool that's often overlooked, letting the bass just go out.
If the audiophile doesn't have a lot of space behind his or her ears on the rear wall, should the audiophile put absorption behind his or her ears on the rear wall or diffusion? If the audiophile, say, something as close as, say, 2 feet to the rear wall, What's the better answer right behind that person's head, absorption or diffusion?
Actually, neither, both. When you're close to the rear wall, you have got a unique situation. The audiophile does not like a dead spot. It's like acoustically strange. It's like having an open to this strange cave full of bugs and monsters. You have no idea. If you can't hear what's behind you because all of a sudden there's an open window, that is not a comfortable, physically comfortable environment for the human to be next to. Aggressive sound absorption near the ear is not good. On the other hand, a large flat wall isn't good either. That's too bright. The reflections are too coming from the back or too strong. The phase add in the bass, the closer you get to the wall, more negligent that really is, because you're in a bass pressure zone. So you don't have phase add cancel issues anymore. What you want is a blend, a fine-grained blend of absorption to quiet the strength of the rear wall down, and diffusion in order to keep some sense of aliveness, but some sense of containment around the back of your head. We solve that problem with a thing we call the matrix panel, which is a very tight-grained 3-inch repetitive on-center repetitive pattern of deep absorption, 3 inches of absorption, modified by a reflective area. Instead of a flat absorbing panel, we have a panel all cut up into pieces, and absorption is spaced apart. So when you talk at that panel, you'd hear nothing strange at all. There's no bass loading, and there's no treble reflection coming back, and it's not absorptive. It doesn't feel like the sound is disappearing in front of you. So it's just a very comfortable, the closest you can get to that kind of sound is a poly diffuser again, because when you are in front or near a poly diffuser, it's reflective, but you don't hear it. And it's a great way to soften the rear wall bounce by using a poly diffuser that mimics absorption, but keeps the energy up, but not loudly.
If the audiophile has planar dipole loudspeakers, what should he or she do with the back wave coming out of the planar dipole? Should the back wave be absorbed or diffused, or is that a matter of personal preference depending on how one wants to achieve a sense of soundstage?
Depending on the width of the dipole. So if the dipole's narrow, then it's kind of like a line source and it diffuses pretty easily, both sides. If it's a wider dipole, now we're talking about beaming sound around the room. It fires as loudly to the rear as it does forward. The rear fire is oftentimes, if it's curved like Martin Logan's, it's actually focused and then hits the front wall and comes back. It's too loud of a reflection. It's like having a tweeter on the front and a tweeter on the back. The rear tweeter, it's not adjusted in volume, turned down so it's a low-level ambient fill. It's actually hitting the wall and coming back. So now we're getting a strong sense of increased stage depth because we're getting a strong reflection in the full treble range, 10 milliseconds, 12 milliseconds time delayed. So now we're getting, it's like instead of the wall, side wall shifts the speaker sideways, front wall bounce gives you stage depth. What happens in the real world, it's too strong of a signal, and they want to quiet it down, and they would like to diffuse it. And so they take a tube trap, line inch, that has absorptive on one side and diffusion on the other, and they set it behind, and then they rotate the reflector forward, and now it's throwing the sound through the diaphragm back at the listener. That's not good. Then they rotate it around, and it absorbs the back wave, and that's not good. They move the trap to the side and adjust the reflector so that the trap is absorbing some of that back wave and side scattering the rest of that back wave, so that the back wave is stored not front to back, but side to side.
And you're suggesting that that tube trap be positioned in that way, not right up against the front wall, but somewhere between the front wall and the split.
Oh yeah, you're intercepting the wave way away from the front wall. If you get too close to the diaphragm, you start to acoustically load it. You should be on the order of 1.5 feet to 2 feet away from that light planar diaphragm in order to not load it.
A bass trap ideally should be located in the area of greatest pressure in the listening room. That's often the front corners and the rear corners. How does a civilian audiophile walk around his or her listening room thinking to myself, how do I listen for the area of greatest bass pressure as I walk around the room? Is there any way to instruct somebody how to do that?
I can tell you how we did it in the olden days. We'd take a 9-inch tube trap, with the smallest one we make, and we'd walk around the room like a divining rod. I mean, this sounds really stupid, okay? But we'd walk around the room. It starts to quiver when it runs into a bass zone, bass pressure zone. It just starts to because it's working with the bass and the bass is driving it, and it's so loud that it starts to quiver. You can feel it. And so we say, aha, put a bass trap there, and it can walk around and just like a divining rod. I mean, it sounds as stupid as, but this is audiophile world.
Art, this has been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron. Great questions.